So attention can be a difficult thing. Where to focus one's attention can be confusing. We experience this every day in ubiquitous computing, in particular. Uh, it's what Richard Lanham calls an attention economy. Our attention is pretty much always divided. Pollution becomes an interesting concept then. We've heard of the concepts of noise pollution, light pollution, but even pollution needs to be taken as an object, somewhat akin to a hyperobject, as detailed by Morton, but an object nonetheless. Such otherwise pollutants are integral figures in our new media rhetorical ecologies, including the rhetorics we compose. We must pay attention to them even when they are distracting us. So Dober and Mori have discussed ecology extensively, but this too often seems tied to the environmental, right, in terms of physics, right, material environment, and such is not what we're after necessarily today. This is an abstraction of ecology. We consider even pollution as potentially productive, not as an effacement of the rhetorical ecology, but as part of it. We so often remark on how Diogenes lived in a barrel, but we don't really see the importance of this, even though it was clearly intentional and rhetorical. The gesture to a certain asceticism and austerity aside, when it comes to Diogenes, the barrel was part of the whole show. The barrel wasn't it, of course, right? Because again, this isn't an object-oriented approach, but it was part of the delivery. It was part of the general personification of Diogenes as a rhetor. The barrel didn't have rhetorical agency, in other words, but it was part of a rhetorical infrastructure, a rhetorical ecology shepherded by Diogenes. And so the question we're asking is, when will rhetoric stop trying to be a science, right? So in practice, this is a push for data programming or code as rhetoric or as algorithms as rhetoric, which we resist a little bit. Remember Diogenes and his barrel in which he lived. My voice does not enact itself, right? My words do not write themselves. And any book you hold does not hold much significance outside of the written content inside of it. So tools are tools, but tools are also just tools, right? So apprehension and appropriation is key. A hammer becomes a hammer through its hammering. A hammer is recognized as such when it fails to function in its hammering, right, as Heidegger taught us in Being and Time. We are marked similarly and in circulation, rhetorically, doxically, ideologically, what have you. If we want a metaphysics of object-oriented thought, then we concede a metaphysics. Objectify your soul, quantify it. We can do that with love or beauty or friendship or desire in the more abstract sense. Go ahead. You may have read the book White Noise. You may have seen the movie, two very different things. The movie is actually about EVP, electronic voice phenomenon. It's supposed to be, the idea with EVP is that it is a conduit for contacting the dead, if I remember correctly. It's an interesting idea, right? So the idea is white noise, right, or static, right? Things that we would maybe consider noise pollution are actually signals, right, to something both living and yet dead, from something dead yet living. When I tell people about electricity, sometimes white noise comes to mind for a lot of reasons. Maybe I sometimes consider electricity as the white noise of literacy, or maybe I consider literacy to be the white noise of electricity. I suppose this depends upon perspective. Failure depends upon perspective too. I'm not sure what we're ever winning when it comes to digital literacy. For example, I go to ball games, and there are all sorts of noise and commotion and distractions. The outing is more than who wins or loses, right? The beer still costs the same regardless of who wins or loses. After all, the objective of the game, right, isn't to win per se, right? It's to put people in stance, right? It's an object commodity. It's dollars and cents. So every ticket sold and every beer and hot dog and nachos bought are part of the game. It's part of the bigger strategy. Consider how many distractions we see at baseball games. But then consider the fact that these aren't really distractions at all. They are actually they're an integral part of the experience, right? And just to note, I really do hate the fucking Eagles, but it seemed like an interesting choice. So to explain electricity real quick, here's a table that I usually show on the screen, but I can't do that today because of this video. And so what this table basically shows is basically three apparatuses, three apparati, right? Orality, literacy, electracy. And we're surely familiar with orality and literacy, right? But what this table indicates, and I won't hold it up the whole time, what it basically indicates is that when we're talking about orality, literacy, and electracy as apparatuses or apparati, we're not just talking about a mode of delivery, right? We're talking about an entire apparatus that has corresponding behaviors, principles, institutions, patterns, right? So, whereas the apparatus of orality, a certain practice, the predominant practice might be religion, right? With the shift into literacy, that would be science. With electracy, it's entertainment, right? From ritual method to method to style, from church to school to internet, so on and so forth. It's important to note that one apparatus shift doesn't negate a previous apparatus. So the shift from orality to literacy doesn't mean that literacy has negated orality, right? They continue to coexist. Same way that the shift from literacy to electracy, that doesn't negate literacy, right? Literacy obviously still exists. It's just that we need to acknowledge an apparatus shift into electracy, because the idea is that referring to electracy as digital literacy is tantamount to referring to orality as or referring to literacy as written orality, right? And so there's a shift significant enough that we need to consider it as an entire apparatus shift rather than just a change in mode of communication, right? And so it's not just about, getting back to the point of the presentation, it's not just about a rhetorical product, right? If we think back to the baseball game example, the rhetorical product is actually embedded within an ecology, right? And in this sense, a new media, new materialist ecology. It's about our actual composing practices. We put it in the context of rhetoric. We care about edamame beans and car engines, not in terms of object-oriented thought, but we, in other words, for some reason we want to speak to edamame beans or even car engines, right? But yet we don't have a sense of ethical concern for hyper objects, right? As destructive as they may be. So the idea here is that in one sense, intentionality doesn't matter, right? But then we have to ask, does a virus matter? Does a cancer? Does a pollution? Right? These are honest questions for object-oriented folks, but they are more easily answered with new materialist approaches to ecology. Also, just so we're clear, I really do hate the fucking Eagles. Our speech is a certain pollution framed in a certain ontological slant. If this is the birth of a new world, right? Again, robust with hyper objects, as Timothy Morton would have it. Then our new is nothing new at all. It's somewhat of an old death, right? And we can't even really talk about death outside of an understanding of ecology. But our understanding of ecology has to take into consideration not just objects, right, as non-human actants, but of the role that even things like noise, right, and light and media objects and more abstract objects play in our rhetorical ecologies.